Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, we've got some really fascinating, maybe even challenging source material you've shared with us.
Definitely challenging. It's from a psychopathologist writing, right after World War II.
Right, a really intense time. And you can feel that context, can't you? It's like these ideas were forged in that fire.
Exactly. He was writing while in mental exile, as he put it, away from his usual labs and libraries. So it's raw, observational.
So our goal here is to really unpack what's in these pages. The author draws these surprising links between how we think individually,
Hmm.
these older sort of primitive thought patterns he says are still around,
Yeah,
and how we act in crowds, how the mass influences us. It's about seeing familiar stuff, thoughts, groups through his, well, unique lens.
it really is.
Yeah.
Getting to grips with how he thinks we, individuals and groups, can end up accepting, well, fictions and chaotic notions.
Okay, let's dive right in because the first big idea hits you straight away and it's a bit destabilizing maybe.
You mean the idea that our thoughts aren't entirely our own?
Yeah, exactly. That we're constantly influenced, swayed by others, and that our thinking isn't just pure reason, it bubbles up from like unconscious patterns too.
He calls realizing that, that we're not these fully independent, rational beings. He calls it tragic.
Wow. And it's tightly linked, he says, to emotions, right? Thoughts and feelings aren't separate boxes.
Not at all. He stresses that our basic drives love, hate, fear. They act on our thinking. They fuel it, even if the final thought seems quite detached from that raw feeling later on.
Okay, but this next bit, this really made me pause. He's pretty critical of traditional logic, like Aristotelian logic.
Yeah, surprisingly so. He argues, look, logic helps avoid massive blunders, sure.
Right.
But for actually resolving real-life disagreements, he thinks it's almost useless.
Why? Because we can't agree on the starting point?
Pretty much. He says getting two people to agree on a mutually acceptable premise is incredibly rare. So that ideal of a clear, calm discussion leading to agreement almost never happens outside pure theory, like math.
Hmm. So, thinking itself, he sees it as this weird biological thing, a biological luxury.
Yeah, almost an evolutionary side effect, tied to us walking upright, having long childhoods, our ability to play.
Play. How does play fit in?
Well, the idea seems to be that these uniquely human things gave us the space for conscious thought, for adjustment. Maybe because we didn't have, like, built-in claws or speed.
So, thinking is for adjustment. It slows us down, lets us tolerate things, adapt. Unlike animals stuck with instinct.
Right. Instinct is fast but rigid. Thinking is slower, more gradual, but gives us almost endless adaptability.
But it's not just practical, is it? He says it's ambivalent.
Exactly. It's both trying to genuinely understand reality, and it's this imaginative escape hatch, a way to deal with the world's difficult questions.
Facing reality and running from it.
Yeah, submitting to nature and kind of creating our own idols, both at once.
So, when our thinking goes off the rails, what's the key issue for him? Seems to come back to thinking and feeling.
Absolutely central. He argues that consciousness needs to separate itself from pure emotion, yes.
Okay.
But thinking cannot survive, cannot stay connected to reality without feeling. That connection is vital.
And delusion is when that connection breaks down.
That's his view. It's either a regression, like old instinctual patterns taking over completely,
Mm-hmm.
or it's consciousness becoming isolated. Thoughts just spinning freely, detached from feeling. Both lead away from reality.
The balance has to be there. Feeling needs thinking. Thinking needs feeling.
We got it. That's the core principle.
Now, this is where it gets really, really interesting for me. He suggests delusion isn't just some extreme psychiatric thing. It's inherent in normal thinking.
Right. He says the kind of delusion psychiatrists treat. It's part of the same basic process we all engage in, just amplified by other problems.
Wow. So what is delusion then in this normal sense?
He calls it an incorrigible idea, something maybe a normal person would die for, a substitute belief
A substitute for what?
for uncertainty. It's forcing certainty where there isn't any, driven by a deep fear of uncertainty.
Ah.
He uses dreams as an everyday example. How our unconscious stuff can just totally swamp our logical waking mind. That's the same mechanism, writ small.
And this idea of the subject thinks. What's that about? Doing the thinking.
It's the idea that the thinker, the self, the ego, it always remains a bit of a mystery, even to itself. No matter how objective we try to be, our view of the world is always our view. Subjective.
Filtered through us.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
thinking is this constant battle against our own mind's built-in unconscious tendencies. The unconscious isn't just storage, it's actively shaping our conscious thoughts.
Which brings us to, why is it so hard to change someone's mind when they seem, well, wrong, deluded?
Yeah, he asks that too. His answer: people get fixated, they fear doubt, they treat their ideas like precious children.
Like Don Quixote fighting for them.
He actually uses that image, yeah. They become defensive, overly attached.
And he mentions conceited thinking, pedantic thinking, types that just can't self-correct.
Right, they might even latch on to really muddled ideas if they sound clever or profound. Drawn to the magic influence of the incomprehensible rather than simple clarity.
People liking things that sound deep, even if they don't quite add up.
Yeah, a kind of intellectual vanity maybe.
Mm.
A resistance to admitting I might be wrong.
Okay. So that's the individual picture, complex. Now, how does he connect this to group stuff, this archaic or primitive thinking?
He sees remnants of older ways of thinking still active in us. Things like hallucination, which he views as losing that sharp line between self and world.
Okay.
Or animistic thinking, seeing intentions in storms or rocks, projecting ourselves onto things.
Like mythology does.
Exactly. And magic thought, the belief that just thinking something or willing it can make it happen in the real world.
Right. But the one he really emphasizes is mystic participation. What's that?
It's a state of mind where there's basically no difference felt between an inner thought and inner feeling and something happening outside.
Like they're connected.
Yeah, like the thought itself has power, influence. He brings up prayer as maybe having echoes of this, the belief that our internal state directly affects the external world.
And this kind of thinking, it breaks down barriers between people.
Yes, it fosters participation, a sense of being merged with a collective event or group.
So archaic thinking in general, it's more emotional, less logical.
Very much so, in his view. Often wordless, dreamlike, easily swayed by the group or the immediate situation, sensitive to emotion but kind of deaf to argument or contradictory evidence.
It doesn't follow formal logic.
Rejects it, finds its own rules, simpler, more powerful. It's run by shared images, collective feelings, not individual analysis.
And he compares this to actual primitive societies, but also says we still have this layer.
Yeah, that's the fascinating bit. He suggests primitive cultures lived in a world more shaped by subjective feelings, by this mystic participation. But then he argues that modern people, even us now, haven't entirely left that behind.
Like in the Middle Ages with witch hunts and stuff?
He points to that, yeah. More ruled by emotion, more prone to mass delusions. He's saying that layer of thinking is still there, under the surface for all of us. It's not that it's illogical necessarily, but the emotional reaction is less controlled, less checked by experience.
And this archaic layer, that this is what gets tapped into in mass movements, totalitarianism.
That's his argument. He sees totalitarian thinking as a direct throwback to this. It hates objective proof, sees individual thought as a threat.
You have to think with the tribe.
Yeah, exactly. He calls it an imperialistic strategy and wants to take over your mind, lull you, stop critical thinking, suppress anything unique or creative. Only the whole matters, the party, the nation.
Not the individual.
Never the individual. He connects it straight to wartime attitudes like armies getting furious about any criticism or bringing back collective punishment.
Punishing the group for one person's actions.
Right. And the word itself becomes incredibly important here.
How so?
Well, language lifts us above animals, obviously. But he notes primitive languages were often super concrete, very specific, but lacked broader, abstract terms, more pictorial.
Okay.
And in this archaic mindset, the word itself can become a kind of magic symbol, packed with power, especially if it's vague, ill-defined.
Vague words being powerful.
Yeah, because you can pour meaning into them. He argues that stirring up the masses often uses these kinds of terms, or just sheer volume sledgehammer blows of windy speeches, rather than clarity.
Appealing to emotion, not reason.
Right, tapping into a sort of motoric lust for talk, a need to vent feelings rather than understand. He saw a rise in this kind of emotional, ecstatic language, these crypto-archaisms, after World War I.
Okay, so let's put it all together. We've got the complex individual mind, these lingering archaic patterns. What happens when people form a mass? Does the mass itself think?
No, he's very clear on that. The mass as an entity doesn't think. The individual thinks, but their thinking is deeply shaped by being in relationship with the collectivity.
So the group influences the thoughts.
Inspires them, often unconsciously. An idea needs that fertile ground, that nourishing soil of the group, to really take off and spread.
And mass isn't just people physically together?
No, it's broader. It includes our connection to tradition, to ancestors, a vertical relationship, you become part of a mass, reading a paper, listening to the radio, even just prepping a speech for a group. It's about that state of collective connection.
And that collective. Very persuasive.
Immensely so.
Yeah.
He says our own arguments feel stronger, unconsciously fortified, just by feeling like we're part of a maybe fictitious majority, especially under stress when we want to just disappear into the crowd.
Lose ourselves in anonymity.
Exactly. And propaganda knows this cold. Repeat a lie often enough.
It starts to sound true. Hypnotic even.
Yeah. He argues that smart reasoning just doesn't pack the same punch with an unorganized mass as big, simple catchwords and emotional triggers. The mass tends to operate at the level of its simplest members.
And things like mass rallies,
Yeah.
they create this pull towards conformity.
A powerful magnetic pull, he says. Even if you go in skeptical, you can feel that ancient urge to identify, to belong. His point is stark. We're way more susceptible to mass influence than we like to admit.
This links back to that identification idea, right? Participating thinking.
Directly. He sees it surviving in us as a sort of baseline passive identification, which ideally grows into empathy, social bonds.
Yeah.
It makes us suggestible, connected.
Which has value, right? Building community, stopping aggression.
Absolutely. It allows us to live together, adopt shared norms, but there's a big danger.
Anonymity.
Anonymity. He sees it as a serious threat to our individual growth. Lost in the mass, you become passive, just echoing others, thinking behind that shield of everyone thinks this.
An interpreter, not an originator.
Precisely. And he warns that mental terror can force people into this state, thought slavery, he calls it.
And technology, modern communication.
He saw it as amplifying the problem, making thought control more efficient, turning people into cogs, thinking slaves in a big machine that strips away personality.
And weirdly, feeling part of that big machine can feel good, like freedom.
Paradoxically, yes. A liberation from individual responsibility.
Right.
Someone else is driving.
So, mass opinion, it's unstable, childish even.
Often, yeah. Based on simple judgments, myths, suggestions, success is the only thing that matters. But that changes in wartime.
How?
It becomes more susceptible. Rumor and terror take hold. People need to justify themselves, so they follow threatening ideas, abandon morals out of fear. He used the example of how Germans saw Chamberlain opinion flipped entirely based on events and propaganda.
Wow. And these suggestive weapons he talks about, catchwords, formulas.
Tools to inoculate the masses, basically. He insists this pressure to conform, to yield, is everywhere, even in democracies.
He gives examples.
Yeah, press campaigns whipping people up, radio causing panic, deliberate lies to build support for war, holy hate, manufacturing a reason to fight, using test rumors just to see how people react.
And dictators like Hitler.
Masters of it, using huge monuments, constant flattery, trying to imbue the masses with fanaticism, keeping everything emotionally charged, fluid, using these grand, vague ideals.
So collective emotion, it's just personal feelings projected onto the group.
Pretty much. And in a climate of fear and rumor, those feelings spread like wildfire. Critical thinking goes out the window. Lack of proof just makes the feelings stronger.
Fertile ground for mass delusions.
Exactly. The delusion becomes a shared slogan, a common catchword. People pour their own private hopes and fears into it. It gives instant emotional satisfaction, so why bother with logic?
Which leads to, well, a really tough question he raises. What are the ultimate consequences of all this? Especially when you add intense fear.
Yeah, he goes into some dark places. He talks about induction psychosis, mental epidemics, things seen in isolated groups, or when whole populations are exhausted, starving, like post-WWII Europe's depressive hangover.
Groups using exhaustion to make people suggestible.
Right, like religious sects using fasting to induce states open to hallucination, delusion. He grimly notes hungry people are dangerous, and delusion lets the mass imagine more.
And historical examples, like the dancing plagues.
Yeah, the modal mass psychoses. St. Vitus danced after plagues or wars. He saw it as a physical attempt to escape overwhelming fear or just release pent-up tension.
And he sees echoes of that today, or in his time.
He did. He looked at modern life, the obsession with speed, cars, planes, jazz, as a similar escape. A frantic movement that ironically pulls people back towards something primitive, like wild dancing children. He even cited the mass chants of Deuce in Italy as a modern version of that ecstatic contagion.
But then he talks about something even darker, suicidal thinking of the mass.
Yes. This is really chilling. He perceived a destructive, almost self-punishing streak in mass thinking, where primal instinct takes over, action trumps judgment, feelings get suppressed.
Heroism as self-punishment. For what?
Precisely for hidden collective guilt. He describes masses as both fearing and loving panic, maybe even unconsciously wanting slavery. His line, "Man in fear does not like freedom," is stark.
And people are more submissive than we think.
Much greater than is usually supposed, he wrote, pointing to the lack of revolt in Nazi Germany as evidence.
And the Children's Crusades.
As a prime example, a religious ideal twisted into a cover for mass regression, aggression, and this terrifying urge for self-destruction, driven by guilt nobody could face.
Guilt. He keeps going back to guilt.
He does. Feeling responsible for terrible things generates immense guilt. He mentioned suicides among invading soldiers, guilt among the victors, too. He saw the post-war era itself as suffused with it. Neurosis, alcoholism, even a bizarre craving for a new war.
Guilt for mass killing, like the atom bomb. It's too big to process.
Yeah, beyond our imagination, he says. So the reaction becomes paradoxical, a kind of suicidal giving in to the idea of the next war. His phrase, "two fighting armies form one suicidal mass," is haunting.
And the atomic fear, specifically.
He saw that fear as stirring up all these archaic feelings. The constant tension, the war of nerves, he argued, actually stimulated aggression by playing on fear and speculation, created confused emotions with no outlet, building towards violence.
So peace is burdened by the guilt of the last war.
Heavily. We celebrate peace, he observed, while preparing for the next war. That vague, global fear of atomic doom. He saw it as dangerous precisely because it works like primitive fear. It bypasses reason and primes us for more aggression.
And believing catastrophe is inevitable.
Is itself a destructive suggestion, he argued. It reinforces the fear and makes the aggression more likely. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay, wow. Let's try and pull some threads together from that. It's a lot. So we've got this picture of human thinking, fragile, influenced by emotion, unconscious patterns, the group.
Not the purely rational machine we sometimes imagine.
And delusion isn't just out there in hospitals, it's somehow baked into normal thinking. Amplified by fear, by wanting certainty, by propaganda.
By those catchwords, those vague symbols that satisfy emotion rather than logic.
And these ancient primitive ways of thinking, mystic participation, animism, they're not gone. They persist and can be exploited or just bubble up in mass panic or even self-destruction.
That's the unsettling core of his argument, yeah. That layer is always there.
And it forces us to look hard at suggestibility, the lure of anonymity, the risk of becoming just parts of a machine.
Losing that individual core, yeah. The mechanization of the soul, almost.
What really strikes me is that constant tension he describes. The individual versus the mass, reason versus these older urges, and how things like fear or technology can tip the balance towards the primitive, the destructive.
Yeah, he really breaks down that easy wall between the rational us and the irrational them or the irrational crowd.
Yeah.
It's all intertwined.
Exactly. Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty big question, right? Stemming from all this. In today's world, arguably even more saturated with information, with collective forces pushing and pulling us. How do you, personally, cultivate what he might call that vital doubt, that essential uncertainty needed for real critical thinking? How do you stay grounded in reality and resist just sinking into, well, comfortable certainty, whether it's your own private delusion or the story the group is telling?